What if I told you that three dudes working out of a janky converted barn in Ohio straight up stumbled onto something that the biggest names in motorsport completely slept on? Not with supercomputers or wind tunnels, but with a borrowed dyno, some salvage factory rollers, and an idea so off the wall that professional race engineers literally clown them to their faces. This is the kind of story that has me shook, no cap, because it flips everything we think we know about how cars are supposed to work completely on its head. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the gap between conventional wisdom and actual innovation in motorsport engineering. If you're someone who geeks out over the technical details behind why certain cars defy expectations on track, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now look, I gotta set the scene here because the context hits different when you understand the full picture. It is March 2019 at Sebring International Raceway. If you know anything about endurance racing, you know Sebring is low-key the great equalizer. The track surface is absolutely gnarly. We are talking about old concrete slabs from a World War II airfield that have been patched and repaved so many times that the bumps got bumps on top of bumps. It is no joke. Cars that feel absolutely dialed in at smooth circuits like Circuit of the Americas come to Sebring and just eat it. Suspensions blow out left and right. Drivers get absolutely wrecked physically. Crews spend entire race weekends just grinding, trying to keep their cars from rattling themselves to pieces. The who's who of endurance racing are posted up there. Factory-backed Porsche teams rolling in with semi-trucks stuffed to the gills with spare parts. Mercedes entries with whole squads of engineers glued to telemetry screens, each one hawking a different subsystem of the car in real time. BMW crews running sims on laptops that cost more bread than most people's cribs. Aston Martin flexing with their immaculate hospitality setups and carbon fiber dripping off everything. Drivers who have won Le Mans multiple times strolling through the paddock like straight-up rock stars, big-timing everybody. The combined bag in that paddock on any given IMSA weekend is absolutely wild. We're talking tens of millions of dollars just for one race when you factor in development costs, testing programs, tire contracts, driver salaries, engineering staff, logistics, and hospitality. A single factory team might blow more bread just getting to the track than most club racers spend in an entire season. That is not even cap. That is just how the game works at that level. And then there is Midwest Motorsports dynamics. These boys roll up in a beat-up converted RV that has definitely seen way better days, towing a trailer they scooped used off Craigslist for $1,200. Their entire race budget for the full season, and I am dead serious here, was less than what Porsche dropped on catering for that single weekend. Let that marinate for a second. One team is spending more on sandwiches and coffee than another team is spending on actual racing. That is absolutely nuts. The paddock talk kicked off immediately. You know how racing paddocks work, right? Everybody is low-key scoping everybody else out. Teams got spotters not just on track, but posted up in the pits, peeping what the competition is doing. So when this ragtag squad pulls in and starts unloading their stuff, people definitely notice. OG veterans were pointing and straight up snickering at their whole setup. Crew members from the professional teams wandered over, trying to play it cool, but really just wanting to get a closer look at what they figured would be a total dumpster fire. The car itself was a modified Ligier JS P320 they had copped as a write-off from a crash at Road Atlanta. The previous owner, some gentleman driver who had sent it hard into the wall at Road Atlanta, basically gave it away for pennies. The tub was straight, which is clutch because that is the important part. The carbon fiber monocoque that protects the driver and is basically the backbone of the whole car had survived the hit. But everything else, suspension components, bodywork, wiring harness, cooling system, all of it needed to be rebuilt or swapped out. For three guys with way more skills than dollars, that was actually perfect. Chef's kiss situation right there. But here is the thing that really had everybody buzzing. The car looked wrong. And I do not mean it looked rough or half-baked. I mean the actual setup of the car violated everything that trained eyes expected to peep. The rake angle, that is a difference in ride height between the front and rear of the whip, was completely off from what anyone else was running. In modern racing, aero dictates a very specific rake angle. You want the front of the car slammed low to seal the front diffuser and splitter to the ground, generating front downforce. The rear rides a touch higher to let airflow rip under the car and accelerate, creating low pressure, which is basically how underbody downforce does its thing. Every team in that paddock was running within a super tight window of rake angles because the physics of aero demands it, or at least everybody thought the physics demanded it. The Midwest car had the front end sitting noticeably higher than anyone else and the rear sitting lower than expected. From a pure aero standpoint, this was leaving downforce on the table. It made zero sense to anyone looking at it. The spring rates were equally sus. The front springs were around 800 pounds per inch, which is way stiffer than what any comparable car was running. Stiffer front springs generally mean less mechanical grip at the front axle, because the suspension cannot conform to surface jank as well. On a track like Sebring, where the surface is about as smooth as a busted-up gravel road in spots, running stiff front springs seemed like a recipe for mad understeer and beating your driver into submission. The rear springs were 450 pounds per inch, which created a front-to-rear spring rate ratio that no vehicle dynamics textbook would ever cosign. And then there was the anti-roll bar situation, or rather the total lack of one. The front anti-roll bar was completely disconnected, just unbolted and left hanging there doing absolutely nothing. Now, for anyone who does not know the deal, anti-roll bars connect the left and right sides of a suspension and keep the car from rolling too much in corners. They are one of the most fundamental tuning tools in all of racing. Every car on every grid in every series runs them. Taking one off entirely is like a chef deciding to never use salt. It is so fundamental that yeeting it does not even cross most people's minds as an option. One scrutineer, those are the officials who go over cars before races to make sure everything is legit and within the regs, pulled Mark Dennis aside and genuinely asked if they needed a hand with their setup. Homie literally thought something had gone sideways during assembly. Dennis just smiled and said they were good, no stress. An engineer from one of the Rebellion racing entries was overheard saying the car looked like someone had set it up using a janky smartphone app. He was not being slick about it either, just straight up throwing shade. In the insular world of professional motorsport, where engineers guard their setup sheets like they are classified government documents and spend weeks sweating over 1/10 of a millimeter ride height changes, seeing a car that appeared to ignore every established principle was basically an insult to their professional pride. Here's what most people do not realize about the culture of professional racing engineering. It is deeply conservative. Not politically conservative, but technically conservative. Despite the whole image of cutting-edge innovation, most teams stay in their lane, within very narrow boundaries of accepted practice. They optimize within known parameters rather than questioning whether those parameters are even the right ones to be chasing in the first place. And the reason for this is actually 100% rational when you think about it. When your budget is millions of dollars and your whole career depends on results, you are not about to go rogue and experiment with radical departures from proven methods. You refine what works. You make small tweaks. You run simulation software that models the car based on established physics, and you trust those sims because they have been validated over years of matching up with real-world data. The problem is that this creates a kind of intellectual echo chamber. Everybody converges on basically the same solutions because everybody is using the same tools and the same assumptions. It is convergent evolution in engineering. Different teams independently landing on the same answers because they are all asking the same questions the same exact way. Nobody is thinking outside the box because the box has been working just fine. Thank you very much. What nobody in that paddock knew was that the three dudes behind Midwest Motorsport's dynamics were not some clueless amateurs who had botched their setup. Nah, they were something way more dangerous to the established order than that. They were experienced professionals who had been forced by circumstance to question the foundations that everyone else just took for granted and never thought twice about. Mark Dennis had put in 15 years as a suspension tech at various IMSA teams. He knew the conventional approach inside and out because he had been living and breathing it his entire career. He had spent thousands of hours dialing in spring perches, shimming damper valves, measuring ride heights with precision tools, and correlating setup changes with driver feedback and data acquisition. He was a beast at it. Legit one of the best in the game. The kind of technician that engineers specifically asked for by name because he could take their theoretical adjustments and translate them into precise mechanical reality with his eyes practically closed. But then his team lost their primary sponsorship, the kind of sudden financial implosion that goes down all the time in motorsport when the money dries up overnight. And Dennis found himself out on the street with a mortgage payment staring him down and skills that did not exactly light up a regular job market. Try explaining shimming race stampers on a resume for an office gig. It does not exactly slap. Jim Catalano was a mechanical engineer, but not from the car world at all. He had spent his whole career designing agricultural equipment, combines, tractors, tillage implements, the kind of heavy-duty machines that most car enthusiasts never even think about twice. But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is low-key the secret sauce of this whole story. Agricultural equipment faces engineering challenges that are in some ways way gnarlier than anything in motorsport. A race car operates on a relatively smooth, predictable surface. The loads are high, but they follow patterns that can be modeled and anticipated by computers. A combine harvester, though? That bad boy has to work on terrain that switches up from minute to minute. Soft soil, hard-packed clay, random rocks, irrigation ruts, sketchy slopes, you name it. The suspension and chassis dynamics of agricultural equipment have to deal with pure chaos in a way that race cars never do. Catalano had spent years cooking up self-leveling systems, predictive suspension algorithms, and testing methods that were optimized for one thing above everything else: keeping it cheap. Farmers are not Formula One teams sitting on unlimited budgets. They need equipment that works reliably, that can be maintained by regular folks without engineering degrees, and that does not cost an arm and a leg. This forced agricultural engineers to develop clever, simple solutions to complex dynamic problems. Solutions that the motorsport world had never even peeped because they never needed to. Their fat budgets let them throw computing power and exotic materials at problems that farmers solved with straight-up ingenuity and old-school common sense. Terry Washington was the third piece of the puzzle. He ran a small machine shop that mostly cranked out parts for local factories. He was not an engineer or a racing professional. He was a machinist, a craftsman, the kind of guy who could look at a part, understand exactly what it needed to do, and make it from raw stock with tolerances tight enough to satisfy an aerospace inspector. What Washington brought to the squad beyond his fabrication skills was something you cannot really put a number on, but was absolutely essential. He had zero preconceptions about how racing was supposed to work. He asked the obvious questions that Dennis and Catalano had been trained not to ask. Why do you even need an anti-roll bar? What goes down if you just yeet it? Why does the front have to be lower than the rear? Who decided that, and how do they actually know they are right? These seemingly basic questions, asked by someone sharp enough to understand the answers, but not weighed down by the assumptions that came with a racing education, turned out to be the spark plugs for genuine innovation. Sometimes the most fire question is the one everybody else thinks is too dumb to ask. Together, they had pooled about 200 grand between them. In motorsport terms, this is basically couch cushion money. A set of tires for a GT car runs a few $1,000s. An engine rebuild can hit you for 50 grand or more. $200,000 does not even cover a proper testing program at most circuits, let alone cop a car, build it out, haul it around, enter races, and pay for fuel and consumables. But they had the barn on Washington's property, they had tools, they had skills, and they had time. Hella time. Because none of them had jobs to go to anymore, which is kind of a vibe when you think about it. Broke, but free. Now, here's where the actual innovation kicks off, and I need you to lock in on the technical foundation because it is genuinely big-brain stuff wrapped in beautiful simplicity. Every suspension system has what engineers call a natural frequency. This is the rate at which a suspension wants to bounce when something disturbs it. Push down on the fender of your ride and let go. It bounces up and down a few times before it chills out. The rate of that bouncing is the natural frequency. In racing, typical natural frequencies fall between 2 and 3 Hz for most cars, meaning the suspension oscillates 2 to 3 times per second. Traditional setup philosophy says you want the front natural frequency to be a little higher than the rear. This creates what the nerds call a flat ride. As the car hits a bump, the front wheels react first, then the rear wheels hit the same bump a split second later. If the frequencies are dialed in correctly, the car stays relatively level because the front is already bouncing back as the rear gets smacked. This is well understood physics, and it absolutely works. It is taught in every vehicle dynamics course and used by every racing team on the planet. No arguments there. But Dennis had clocked something during his years grinding in the paddock. He had access to setup sheets and telemetry data from dozens of different cars over his career, and he had developed a habit of looking at this data not as individual numbers, but as patterns. He was not just analyzing what the spring rate was. He was analyzing what went down when that spring rate interacted with that damper setting on that tire at that ride height on that specific track surface. And in this wider view, he started noticing outliers. Every now and then, a car with a theoretically trash setup would post competitive lap times. Not often, maybe once every few race weekends. But it happened consistently enough that it was not just random luck or a fluke. These outliers were always written off by the engineering community. Oh, the driver was just feeling himself that session. Track conditions happened to vibe with that particular setup. The tires were in an unusually sweet window. Statistical noise, bro. Every engineer Dennis chopped it up with had a logical explanation for why these outlier performances did not mean jack. And each individual explanation was totally plausible on its own. But Dennis started collecting these outliers systematically, like a detective building a case. He plotted them, he compared them, and he found something that nobody else had found because nobody else had bothered to look. The fast outlier setups had absolutely zero consistency in their individual parameters. Spring rates were all over the place. Ride heights varied like crazy. Damper settings seemed completely random. There was no common thread in any single variable that connected these unexpectedly fast configurations. But when Dennis peeped the relationship between front and rear natural frequencies under combined loading conditions, meaning not just static sitting in the garage, but under the simultaneous forces of braking, cornering, and acceleration that are all happening at once in real driving, a pattern popped off. Let me break this down with an analogy, because the physics gets real dense real quick. Think about noise-canceling headphones. They work by picking up ambient sound and producing a sound wave that is exactly the opposite, the inverse of that noise. When the two waves meet up, they cancel each other out. Destructive interference is the technical term. The result is silence where there was noise. Pretty sick, right? Dennis discovered that certain suspension setups created a similar phenomenon between the front and rear axles of a race car. Under specific dynamic conditions, the oscillations of the front suspension would interact with the oscillations of the rear suspension in a way that straight up canceled out unwanted chassis movements. The car would hit a bump that should have upset its balance, and absolutely nothing happened. The energy was absorbed not by the dampers, which is how it normally works, but by the interaction between front and rear suspension motions talking to each other. The oscillations destructively interfered with each other, producing a net motion at the chassis level that was remarkably small and stable. The car was basically canceling its own noise. Here's the thing though, this effect only popped off at very specific combos of front and rear natural frequencies, and those frequencies shifted depending on the dynamic load state of the car. Under braking, the front suspension compresses and the rear extends, changing both natural frequencies on the fly. In a corner, the loaded side squishes down and the unloaded side extends. Under acceleration, the rear loads up and the front gets light. In real driving, all of these things are happening simultaneously and continuously, never sitting still for a second. Finding a static setup that would produce beneficial frequency interactions across all of these constantly changing conditions was like trying to find one specific grain of sand on an entire beach. You straight up could not calculate it with traditional methods because the interactions were too complex and too dependent on transient conditions that changed faster than any simulation could model in real time. The math was just too gnarly. This is where Catalano's agricultural engineering background became absolutely clutch. In agriculture, you cannot afford million-dollar test programs because your customer is a farmer in Iowa, not a Formula One team in Monaco. Catalano had developed testing methods using cheap accelerometers and basic data logging gear that could characterize suspension behavior quickly and on the low budget-wise. He adapted these methods for the Ligier, and it was honestly kind of genius. They slapped accelerometers all over the car, dozens of them, recording vibrations at the wheels, the uprights, the chassis, the subframes, basically everywhere they could stick a sensor. Then they built a crude but effective simulation rig in Washington's barn. They put the car on industrial rollers salvaged from a closed factory, allowing the wheels to spin while the car stayed put. By applying loads through straps and hydraulic jacks while the car was running on the rollers, they could simulate cornering, braking, and acceleration forces without ever leaving the barn. Shade tree engineering at its absolute finest. It was not pretty. Professional teams would have been straight up appalled by the setup. But it worked, and it let them do something that no professional team would ever attempt because of the insane cost. They tested over 4,000 different setup configurations in 3 months. 12-hour days, 7 days a week, no days off. Change the front springs, run the test, record the data. Change the rear ride height, run the test, record the data. Adjust the damper settings, run the test, record the data. 4,000 combos. Their neighbors for real thought they had lost their minds, hearing the engine screaming in the barn at all hours of the day and night. The HOA was probably losing it too, but out in rural Ohio, nobody was about to say anything. But patterns started jumping out of the data. Certain combos of settings that looked completely wrong by traditional standards produced remarkably stable chassis behavior under dynamic loading. The accelerometer traces would show big suspension movements at the wheels, exactly what you would expect from apparently sus spring rates and damper settings. But the chassis-mounted sensors would show almost nothing. The body of the car was staying stable while the wheels were doing all the heavy lifting. It was as if the suspension had become self-canceling, soaking up energy through internal interactions, rather than passing it along to the chassis. Wild stuff. By February 2019, they had locked in 12 setup configurations that showed this beneficial interference pattern. But dyno testing and barn sims only tell you so much. They needed real track time, with real speed and real consequences. The problem was that private test days at proper circuits cost bread they simply did not have stacked up. Renting Sebring for a day runs tens of thousands of dollars before you even factor in fuel, tires, and the inevitable mechanical drama that comes with running a rebuilt wreck at full send racing speeds. So they got creative, as broke people always do. They entered the car in NASA endurance races, small-time club racing events where the entry fees were a few $100 and nobody cared what your whip looked like or how it was set up. They were not there to chase trophies, they were there to farm data. Nobody paid them any mind at these events, just another privateer team filling out the grid, running a car that looked a little funky but was clearly legal. The other competitors were enthusiasts running modified street cars and purpose-built race cars on modest budgets. People who were there for the love of going fast, not to analyze suspension frequency interactions. It was the perfect cover for a radical testing program, hiding in plain sight like a boss. And the data from these events was revealing something absolutely bonkers. Based on their spring rates, ride heights, and alignment settings, their theoretical lap times should have been 3 to 4 ticks off the pace of comparable cars. The physics was crystal clear. Stiffer front springs reduce front grip. Higher front ride height reduces front downforce. No front anti-roll bar lets the car roll like a boat, which should upset things in transitions. Every individual parameter pointed to a car that should be slow as molasses. Instead, they were within a second of way better funded and way better prepared teams. And here's the crucial part, the part that had Dennis absolutely gassed when he looked at the data. Their lap times were insanely consistent. While other cars would vary by 2 or 3 seconds from lap to lap depending on fuel load, tire temp, traffic, and the dozens of other variables that mess with pace in any race, the Midwest Motorsports car varied by about half a second. That kind of consistency is basically unheard of in amateur racing. Professional teams with millions of dollars in simulation and data analysis spend entire testing programs grinding to achieve that level of repeatability. These 3 dudes had stumbled into it through their frequency interaction setup. Absolutely unreal. Now, consistency might not sound hype. When people think about racing, they think about outright speed, about the fastest lap, about the dramatic sends for the lead. But in endurance racing, consistency is literally the whole game. It is more important than peak speed, full stop. Let me hit you with a concrete example so this lands right. Car A can rip a fastest lap of 1 minute 55 seconds, but over a 40-lap stint, its average is 1 minute 59 because of tire degradation, fuel weight changes, and thermal management issues dragging it down. Car B can only manage a fastest lap of 1 minute 58 seconds, but its average over the same stint is 1 minute 57.5 because its performance barely budges regardless of conditions. Car B is going to be ahead at the end of that stint despite being 3 whole seconds slower at its peak. This is the math of endurance racing, and the Midwest car was exploiting it without even trying to. They had accidentally hacked the system. So, they decided to go big or go home. They entered the IMSA Michelin Pilot Challenge at Sebring as a one-off. This was not some rinky-dink club race. This was professional endurance racing against factory-supported teams with professional drivers and engineering resources that absolutely dwarfed anything they could dream of. It was supposed to be their proof of concept. Show up, run consistently, gather data at a higher level of competition, maybe attract some investors or partners who could fund proper development of their approach. What actually went down exceeded anything they had imagined in their wildest dreams. Practice sessions made them the joke of the paddock. The car's visual behavior on track was so different from everything else that it drew attention for all the wrong reasons. Photography enthusiasts were snapping pics because the car looked straight up bizarre going through corners. The nose was too high, the rear squatted too much under acceleration like it was doing a wheelie. The car rolled noticeably more than anything else on the grid through transitions. That moment between turning one direction and flipping the other way, where the car shifts its weight from side to side. A properly set up race car does this crisp and quick. The Midwest car wallowed through transitions like a boat caught in a crosswind. It was not a good look, at least not to the untrained assumption. A data engineer from one of the Porsche teams pulled up their telemetry on the publicly available timing screens and started using it in a presentation to his drivers as an example of what not to do. This is the car we do not want to look like. These are the traces that tell you your setup is cooked. He was literally using Midwest Motorsports as a teaching tool for bad engineering. The irony of this was about to hit like a freight train. But Dennis and his crew were not sweating it one bit. They knew what the data actually meant under the hood, so to speak. They understood that human eyes and even experienced engineering intuition expect to see certain visual cues that signal performance. We associate a flat, stable-looking car with speed. We see body roll and assume the car is losing grip. We see a high nose and assume the front end is not generating downforce. These associations are usually on the money, which is exactly why they have become hardwired into racing culture. But in this specific case, they were totally misleading. The Midwest car was allowing specific frequencies of movement at the chassis level while completely killing others. It looked loose and sloppy, but the frequencies of motion that actually affect tire contact patch and grip were being suppressed by the destructive interference effect. The car was not fighting the bumps, it was letting them cancel each other out like noise-canceling headphones for a chassis. Absolute galaxy brain move. Qualifying was where the first cracks appeared in the paddock's certainty about these so-called clowns. In a field of 38 cars, Midwest Motorsports qualified 15th. Now, on its own, 15th is not exactly front-page news. It is solidly midfield. But for a three-man squad running a rebuilt wreck against factory-supported entries with professional drivers who qualified cars for a living, 15th was absolutely raising eyebrows. People started looking more carefully at the actual data instead of just laughing at the visuals. The speed drop numbers told a spicy story. Down the main straight, the Midwest car was slow, about 5 miles per hour slower than comparable cars. Their higher front right height and disconnected anti-roll bar created more drag than a properly set up car, and that cost them straight line speed. In a series where passing often happens on straights, this was a real disadvantage and no way around it. But their minimum corner speeds were inexplicably cracked. Through the carousel, one of Sebring's signature corners, a long, bumpy, decreasing radius right-hander that absolutely punishes any instability, the Midwest car was carrying 4 miles per hour more than cars with twice the downforce budget. 4 miles per hour might not sound like much to a casual fan, but in racing terms, at that part of the track, it is absolutely massive. It represents a fundamentally different level of grip and driver confidence through the most demanding section of the entire circuit. The engineers who saw those numbers did a double take. Race day. 4 hours of racing on one of the roughest tracks in North America. The conventional wisdom for Sebring is to run relatively soft springs to soak up the bumps and just accept the handling degradation that comes with it as a necessary trade-off. You sacrifice peak performance for survivability. The thinking is that a slightly slower car that stays consistent beats a faster car that falls apart, which is exactly the same philosophy that Midwest Motorsports was running, just through a completely different mechanism that nobody had ever seen before. The start was chaos, as it always is at Sebring. 3 cars made contact in turn 1. Dennis, wheeling the opening stint, kept it clean and settled into his rhythm. And the rhythm was the whole story. Lap after lap, the times clicked off with machine-like regularity. 158.2, 158.5, 158.1, 158.3. The variation was less than half a second, absolutely locked in. An hour into the race, they were still running 15th, right where they had qualified, but the gap to the leader had not grown. In fact, it had actually shrunk a little, not because the Midwest car was getting faster, but because everyone else was getting slower. Tire degradation, fuel load changes, brake fade, all the normal stuff that eats away at performance over a stint was hitting the competition harder than it was hitting the frequency interaction setup. The Midwest car was just vibing. The first round of pit stops exposed their biggest weakness, though. Professional teams with practice crews and pneumatic wheel guns could bang out a full service stop, driver change, and 4 tires in under a minute. Midwest Motorsports had Washington doing tires on one side while Catalano handled the other side and Dennis climbed out. 2 minutes and 15 seconds. They dropped 3 spots. In a professional racing series, that kind of pit stop time is brutal. Teams spend thousands on equipment and hundreds of hours practicing to shave seconds off their stops, because track position is everything in this game. But here is where the magic of their whole approach really started hitting. Catalano hopped in the driver's seat and the lap times did not budge. New driver behind the wheel, worn engine running hotter than ideal, track surface temp climbing as the Florida sun was absolutely cooking the old concrete, more rubber getting laid down, changing the grip characteristics of every single corner. All of these variables that normally cause lap times to bounce around, sometimes by a lot, had essentially zero effect on the Midwest car. It was still banging out 158s like clockwork. The BMW that had gapped them in the pits had fresh rubber and a professional driver, but was only marginally faster. And as those new tires wore off their initial peak, the BMW's time started dropping, while Catalano kept hammering out the same pace like a metronome with zero chill. 2 hours in, they had crept back up to 12th, not through sick overtakes or hero moves, through attrition and pure mathematics. Teams ahead were starting to catch problems. A Porsche developed a brake issue that cost them 30 seconds over 5 laps before they could pit. A McLaren spun in turn 17 and lost 2 spots. An Aston Martin had a suspension failure, specifically a damper that could not handle the relentless beating of Sebring's surface, the very kind of component failure that the Midwest car setup was immune to, because it was not relying on dampers to do the heavy lifting in the first place. The Midwest car just kept trucking. No drama, no degradation, no panic on the radio, just relentless metronomic pace that slowly and steadily moved them up the order as faster but less durable cars fell away around them like dominoes. It was honestly beautiful to watch if you understood what was happening underneath. The turning point came at hour 3 when a full course caution bunched the whole field back up. Everybody pitted, fresh tires, full fuel, driver changes all around. But when racing resumed, the professional teams had all made setup adjustments during the stop, chasing the evolving track conditions like they always do, tweaking tire pressures, adjusting anti-roll bars, whatever they could get their hands on in the time allowed. Midwest Motorsports changed absolutely nothing. They could not even if they wanted to. Their setup only worked at exactly the configuration they had discovered through thousands of hours of barn testing. Any adjustment, even a small one, would break the harmonic balance that made the whole thing function. Washington climbed in for the final stint with the car exactly as it had started the race that morning. Same springs, same ride height, same everything. With 40 minutes to go, they were sitting in 8th. With 20 minutes remaining, after an Audi tire failure and a McLaren electrical issue took out 2 more cars ahead, they were 6th. Engineers from the factory teams were scrambling at their monitors, pulling telemetry, trying to figure out what the heck was going on. The data was contradicting itself in ways that broke their brains. Massive suspension travel that should have meant instability and a car that was undrivable, yet perfectly smooth and consistent quartering forces that looked like they came from a much more sophisticated machine. It was like the suspension was moving all over the place, but the chassis just was not. Nobody could explain it with the tools and mental models they had. The final laps became a straight-up battle with a factory Porsche, the kind of matchup that should absolutely never happen in a million years. Washington, a 53-year-old machinist from Ohio who had never raced professionally in his life, trading positions lap after lap with a funded team and a proven driver who does this for a living. Through the carousel, Washington's superior corner exit speed gave him the advantage every single time. The setup that looked wrong to everybody watching allowed him to get on the gas earlier, accelerating hard while the Porsche driver was still wrestling his degrading car into balance and trying to keep it between the lines. The Porsche had more raw speed, but Washington had something better: predictability. He knew exactly what the car was going to do every single time, and that confidence let him push in places where the Porsche driver had to hedge his bets. Across the line, 5th place. 5th freaking place! 3 guys from a barn in Ohio running a rebuilt wreck on a shoestring budget finished 5th at Sebring ahead of factory-backed machinery with professional everything. Let that sink in for a second. That is absolutely insane. David did not just show up to fight Goliath, David caught a top 5 against the whole squad of Goliaths. The aftermath changed everything overnight. Within a week, Dennis received calls from 3 major teams offering consulting contracts with numbers that would have set all 3 of them up nicely. They turned them all down, every single one. Instead, they published their findings on a free website, completely open sourcing something that straight up could have made them millionaires. Just gave it away to anyone who wanted to learn from it. Dennis explained it simply when people asked why. Racing had become too expensive, too exclusive. Only teams with the fattest wallets could compete because the traditional approach to optimization required resources that priced everyone else out. We wanted to level the playing field and show that innovation does not have to come with a $1 million price tag. They only raced 3 more times after Sebring. They won once at Mid-Ohio in the rain, where their setup stability advantage was even more disgusting because the unpredictable surface amplified the frequency interaction effect. Then they just stopped, sold the car to a museum, hung it up, and went back to their regular lives. Dennis went back to independent suspension consulting, but only for underfunded teams. Catalano returned to engineering, designing suspension systems for emergency vehicles using racing principles. Washington still runs his machine shop, though now half his business comes from racing teams wanting custom fabricated parts. The frequency interaction principle is now taught in engineering schools across the country. It is called the Dennis Catalano effect in the textbooks, and it has changed how a whole generation of engineers thinks about suspension dynamics. But the real lesson is not technical, and it never was. It is philosophical. Sometimes the biggest barrier to innovation is not technology or money. It is the assumption that the way things have always been done is the way they must be done. When everybody's optimizing the same variables, using the same tools and the same assumptions, everybody hits the same ceiling. It takes someone who cannot afford to play by those rules to discover that the rules themselves might be wrong. The next time you see a car that looks wrong on track, riding too high, rolling too much, doing things that should not work according to the textbook, take a second look before you start clowning. It might just be someone who couldn't afford conventional wisdom finding a faster way to the finish line. Because if 3 dudes in a barn can outsmart factory teams with unlimited budgets, what other impossible things are just sitting there waiting for someone broke enough and bold enough to try them?